Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Championship Showcase, Secrets for Success, from the playing field of competition to the field of life. We've been speaking with inspirational sports leaders who are sharing their life strategies and empowering messages of hope and purpose to support those athletes that are seeking to make a successful transition. My name is Dominic Militello, and we're so glad you could join us today. We have a very intelligent and passionate guest with us today, so let's jump right in. Today we're speaking with Dr. Steve Smith. Dr. Smith is a licensed clinical psychologist, professor of clinical psychology at Palo Alto University, and the co-director of clinical training of the PGSP Stanford Consortium. He was formerly on faculty at the UCSB and consulting psychologist to UCSB's Division I Department of Athletics. He has a private practice where he works with children, adolescents, and adults with specialization in sport, health, emotional concerns, and bereavement. In addition, he gives many invited talks and presentations each year to professional conferences, schools, athletics clubs, work groups, and parenting organizations. Dr. Smith received his PhD in clinical psychology from the University of Arkansas in 2001. He completed his internship and postdoctoral fellowship at the Harvard Medical School before serving as a staff psychologist at the Massachusetts General Hospital. He is the author of over 40 empirical papers and has authored or edited 5 books. You can see why it makes sense to have Dr. Steve Smith on with us today. Dr. Smith, welcome to the Championship Showcase.
Hi, Dominic. I'm glad to be here.
Well, we know you're busy, and we really appreciate your time. For those of us, well, not for us, but for those that may not be as familiar with your background, can you tell us a little bit about your story and your upbringing?
Sure. I grew up in the Deep South and was really not all that interested in sports, which is always the thing that people find curious about me. I wasn't a big athlete as a little kid. Certainly much more drawn toward academics and things like that. But in my teen years, I discovered the sport of bicycle racing, and through magic and circumstance, I really fell in love with that sport and was involved with it at different levels of intensity throughout most of my life until even into my mid to late 30s, and I was a semi-pro cyclist and traveling all over the country, racing and competing and all that kind of good stuff. So my finding my way into sports has been a little sideways and a little crooked, but it's certainly been a huge part of my career. My background as a psychologist was far more broad, and I was trained in child clinical psychology in a very traditional sense. And it really wasn't until 8 or 10 years ago that I got really interested in the psychological aspect of sport and competition and health.
Okay, great, excellent. Well, you certainly have a storied background. Right off the bat, let's just kind of jump into it. I'm really curious to know how we can use sports psychology for helping athletes to be their best on the field. How can we relay that or translate that to help athletes who are in transition?
Oh, and in transition, yeah, it's such a, as you know, it's such a curious and painful time for a lot of athletes to move from their identity as athletes into their identity as either non-athletes or former athletes or less competitive athletes. And for most of them, that is a period of pain and difficulty and a sense of being lost and untethered. But, as is true for on-field performance, it's about having a good game plan, and often some preparation around that is really helpful. And it's also about having a broad background and a broad perspective on who you are, not only as an athlete, but as a partner and as a friend and as a worker and as a student, so that you have a broader way of thinking about yourself than just one aspect of your performance or the one aspect of your life.
Sure, absolutely. And I think when athletes hear that, for the most part, I remember growing up and somebody saying, "Well, what are you going to do after?" And I was like, "Man, after? What do you mean after? I want to get to the highest level first, then we'll go from there." Mm-hmm. How can you, or what's the best strategy to get this information to athletes sooner that they should be thinking about their post-athletic career?
Yeah. It's a great question, and many athletes that I've worked with have kind of faced that, had the same sort of attitude I think that you did in terms, and I think there's almost a feeling with a lot of athletes like, oh geez, if I think about that, then that makes it more real, and it just makes it a slippery slope, right?
Right.
Am I bailing out on my dream by just having a thought?
Right.
So part of what I have to do is diffuse the fear around that. Like, oh no, this is a really good thing for us to think about. It's painful in some ways, and it may spook you, but it's also really important. And quite honestly, having a broader perspective of ourselves makes us better athletes. The research on this is really, really interesting in that athletes who have a broader sense of self and can think about themselves in a multitude of domains and areas as being skilled in a lot of ways perform better as athletes and are less likely to choke under pressure and things like that. So if an athlete has a really well-rounded and diversified sense of self, they're going to perform better on the field. And so part of the work that I do with all athletes, regardless of age, and particularly younger athletes, is attending to all of their different identities and all of their different selves so that we can begin to have that conversation about what aspect of yourself do you want to express in your life after you're expressing it as an athlete.
Interesting stuff. And you mentioned age there. Do you find there's a difference with those athletes that make more money than other athletes in this particular process?
Yes, in that, the more we're compensated for doing anything, the more extrinsic value it starts to have. And psychology research has known that for millennia now, that the more you pay somebody to do something, the less personally invested they often feel in it, which is why we tend to feel better about our volunteer work sometimes than we do from our own jobs. So often when athletes are getting paid a lot of money, they tend to begin to think of it more like a business. And they understand that this business and this commodity is short-term, and often they will have that perspective of being able to have that, and certainly not always, but will often have that perspective of this is a short-term investment, and I need to be thoughtful about this because I'm engaged in this line of work. But, athletes who aren't paid very much, the thing that is keeping them motivated is the dream. And the bigger the dream, the harder it is to imagine putting that dream down. And it feels more like they're executing a passion rather than just acting a job where they're punching a clock and maybe we'll do something different.
Interesting. And I know this process has been equated to the grieving process, the mourning of a loss. What are your thoughts around that?
Well, I can tell you that from personal experience. I talked about my career in cycling, which was as big and as important to me than anything else that I've ever done in my life. I mean, and really took on a life of its own where, I was just so motivated by that and so involved in that sport and really tried to take it to the highest level that I possibly could. But at a certain point, I developed a bizarre vascular condition that only seems to affect elite-level cyclists. And after surgery and rehab, Humpty Dumpty didn't go back together again. So I lost that. In 2013, I did my very last bike race, and something that had given me so much meaning and so much purpose and a sense of self, all of a sudden I didn't have that anymore. And what I went through then was incredibly painful and just a feeling of being terribly lost and really confused and angry and like, well, maybe I was ready to retire anyway, but I want to go out on my own terms, and just having all those kinds of thoughts and feelings, and and really being lost and searching. And I was an amateur athlete. I had a job and relationships and all these other things that were separate from that. So it's a small sliver of how huge that is for a lot of athletes. And then, my background is I've worked with bereavement forever. I mean, that's something that I've done since I was in graduate school. And when I started working with athletes, it became really clear to me that athletes who had either retired or had to leave a sport because of injury went through those same stages of grief, and really feeling lost and abandoned, and a sense of self that doesn't stick together quite as well, and being angry about that, and sometimes being self-destructive around that. And the parallels there are really profound, and I think not enough people really understand that.
Well, and that's some of the things I would like to discuss with you and maybe share with our listeners, that process, because as somebody who went through it yourself, I mean, you've studied in the field of psychology, you went through it, and whether you're a high school state champion or a Super Bowl champion, the feelings of the time and the commitment to put into that to win. I think the high school kid who never goes on to play another game after high school but wins that championship has the same feeling of accomplishment as the Super Bowl champion, but they also maybe go through the similar processes of moving away. And so what are those steps that helped you overcome that loss?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's the thing that is being lost is not the sport. And that's the thing that I think people forget is when I had to quit racing bikes, I didn't lose cycling. I lost myself as a cyclist. And so the thing that we are grieving in those moments is not the loss of the sport, but it's a loss of a way of thinking about yourself. And that piece is far more painful, right? And so anytime that we lose a sense of self, that's always so much more profound and so much painful. And it also leaves us feeling very lost and very confused. And so, the stages of grief, I think anybody can find with a quick Google search, and those are, more or less debated by literature and science. But essentially, there's this process of kind of bargaining and maybe thinking, well, maybe I can still do some way, or maybe I'll make it next year, or maybe I won't be pro this year, but I'll be able to come back. And so there's that process, and then usually some anger that goes along with that, and some resentment and feeling like things are unfair. And sometimes the anger takes the form of a depression, or doing things that are really self-destructive, like drinking and engaging in risky behaviors. Some self-injury, often when you see like head injuries happen and things like that. And then finally, like this period of acceptance of really realizing, okay, this is the new normal, and the things that I did, I was able to do, and maybe there are things now that are left undone. So there's always stuff in my cycling career I wish I could have done, and that never goes away. Those things will always be there. That's always going to be kind of a nagging sensation. But I can also look back on what I did do and what I was able to accomplish. And so being able to find a way to make some peace with that, and then still, especially for athletes, finding a way to rediscover their bodies a little bit, right? I mean, being an athlete, it's got something to do with a particular sport, but it has so much more to do with a mindset and a way of being in our bodies and being healthy, and maybe being around teammates or whatever it is, that what are those components of an athletic career that we can continue in a new way?
So very interesting. And the thing that comes to mind as you're talking is what you were mentioning earlier, is having that broad scope. Maybe that having a broader scope of self lessens that process of grieving when you do transition, because you have other interests maybe and other ways to express yourself.
Yes, exactly right. Exactly right.
Why do you think more is not being done in this field across the board? I mean, it doesn't matter if you're a tennis player, golfer, rugby player, football player, or maybe you feel it is. Do you feel that it is getting the attention it needs, or should there be more attention on this particular subject?
I think what you're doing here is fantastic and really important because there's just no way that enough is being done. This is a really overlooked topic. Maybe it's less overlooked at higher levels of sport, but especially around kids and like that high school athlete you talked about, just not enough done for that kind of person. And part of the reason is, of course, money and funding, right? I mean, so the sports industry is built around those who are currently participating, not those who are ending their participation. Coaches are oriented toward the game that's currently in play, not the game that was in play. And so I think that there's just a big crack here that people are falling through. And I think for psychologists, much like myself, most psychologists just don't understand this. And like, well, you used to play football, but now you don't anymore. So isn't that great that you have all that extra time? I just don't think they quite understand the role of sports in the life of an athlete.
Right, exactly. I totally agree. And just out of curiosity, what was it about the field of psychology that you gravitated towards, or why the field of psychology for you?
Well, I think psychologists are often born rather than taught or something. But I think I was always kind of an empathetic kid who was really curious about how people worked and wanted to try to understand the nature of the human condition and also do something that's useful and meaningful. And psychology is a great way to understand ourselves, and it's a great way of helping other people understand themselves and kind of looking for ways to be connected and useful. I think that's what has drawn me in and kept me interesting forever.
You're listening to the Championship Showcase. We're speaking with Dr. Steve Smith. Dr. Smith, talk to us a little bit more about you talked about the bereavement process and maybe the comeback syndrome a little bit, anger, acceptance. In working with an athlete that is struggling, what is the process, or what would you like them to do initially to kind of start this process of rediscovering themselves?
Yeah. Well, if I had a magic wand, the initially that you speak of would start when they're like 8. In that, in the work that I'm doing now with students and certainly in my practice, I talk about this notion of having a horizontal kid, meaning a kid with broad interests, lots of resources, and a way of thinking of themselves and their identity that spans across a lot of different domains, so that you don't have a kid who just thinks of themselves as an athlete or doesn't just think about themselves as a math genius or whatever, that they have a broad array of interests, a very diversified portfolio. So we talk about that in the work that I'm doing now as being a horizontal kid. And like I mentioned, horizontal kids tend to be better athletes. They often are better in school, and they're just more resilient. So if all of a sudden something is taken away, then there's other things for them to fall back on that still give them a sense of self and a sense of being important. And so if we begin to have that discussion early on, which is why I'm interested in youth sport too, then we can grow really healthy, good athletes who think of themselves as more broadly than that, so that they can begin to think about themselves after their sporting career as still being healthy, as still being athletes, but just not competing at the same level or maybe even the same sport. Because the thing I really don't want is for athletes to reach the pinnacle of their career, tap out, and then retire and never engage in health or sport thereafter. And unfortunately, research tells us that happens a lot. So Later on in an athlete's career, college level and at the pro level, I think it's never too late to start thinking about that. It's never too late to start expanding that sense of self, to work on other skills and other abilities, and to really put pencil to paper and start planning that post-retirement life. And that's true for any business or industry, not just sport. Like, you have to be thinking about the exit plan and the next step. So I think it's just never too late to start that process.
Well, it's interesting too. As you're talking, I'm thinking about my dad, who was a doctor, wanted to transition but didn't know how. I think about military personnel that come home and after their service is over, trying to get back into civilian life. And what I'm hearing you say is it's obviously not just athletes that are going through this, but it could be anybody making a transition.
Yes, that's certainly true. That's certainly true. And what we see in the literature is that people have increased levels of stress and depression and anxiety around those points of transition as they reestablish new normal. And the more they have to work with, the shorter that period of pain of transition will last.
So having said that, let's say you have an athlete that has not had the education in this post-career process, and is really just coming into your office lost, saying, listen, I retired 2 years ago, I've job hopped a little bit, I've lost some savings, my relationship has kind of gone down the toilet, I don't know where to turn, I don't know what to do. How do you start that process with an athlete that comes to you in that manner?
That's a great question. I think the first thing that I would be curious about with them is, have they grieved? Because often you find athletes who are kind of in that they're still stuck to their athletic career with a bit of a rubber band, in that they haven't quite realized that it is the new normal. And often that sense of being lost is partly not coming to grips with the fact that they are in a different continent and that things are different. And that sort of feeling of just sort of spinning around, I think, just feels to me as though they're still hanging on to that career. And so part of what I would really work with them on is, you need to understand that's over now, that you really have to reboot now and start this whole thing over again. And then helping them talk about, well, what is it about you that made you a successful athlete? So what are the attributes that you had other than, speed and agility and all those kinds of things? Like, what are your values, and what is your work ethic like? And because what makes successful athletes is something about, genetics and skill, but it's also something else, right? It's a system of values. It is a way of being that I think translates into everything. And so if they can find a way to exercise that system of values, then I think it will begin to help them harness some inner resources that maybe they're not making use of.
It's interesting as you're talking, I'm thinking, particularly about my situation, I always, I always had the belief that because I was in the newspaper and on the radio and highlights of the, 6 o'clock news channel, whatever, that when I did retire, that somebody would have seen me on television and make me a VP of sales or marketing just because I could score goals and I was a hard worker and a good teammate and committed to my craft. The reality is, when I got out there into the real world and started interviewing, after the initial talk of, oh yeah, tell us about your professional background, well, they wanted to know, could you sell? Could you market? Could you type? Could you? And, every time I remember just looking across going, listen, I've been doing this thing for so long, but all I need is a shot and opportunity, and I know I'll learn it and can do it. And what I heard time and time again was, well, we're looking for somebody with experience.
Yeah.
So here I was, 24 years old, 25 years old, married with a couple kids, and I'm thinking I'm going to jump into the senior VP level, and they're saying, well, we have a job down in the mailroom, and my ego for the longest time wouldn't let me do that.
Yeah. Yeah. You should never be ashamed of hard work, is what my mom always said to me. Never be ashamed of hard work, and I think you're right that sort of loss of status is a huge thing, and it's a gigantic barrier to all of a sudden going from being a somebody to a nobody, but just recasting that, like, okay, well, this is just the next chapter, and you do have to start at the very bottom. But that doesn't mean that you are a failure, and it doesn't mean that you're less than you used to be. You're just different, and you're having to work something very different, and that takes time and talent and dedication the same way that it did in sport. And you weren't the very best athlete right out of the box. You had to work at it, and this is the same thing.
I was going to say, what is one thing that has really jumped out for you over the course of your practice and working with people of all situations? What's the one thing that has really jumped out to you surrounding athletes in transition particularly?
Yeah, it's a couple things. I mean, the manner of the transition, I think, it makes a big difference, or it can make a big difference in that athletes who are forced to retire because of injury, that's real different than going out on your own terms. It just has a different flavor to it. And I think going out on your own terms, of course, that's going to be better, right? Because you can plan for that, you can think about it, you can make a choice. Sometimes you don't make that choice when you should, and you kind of drag it for a while, and that's its own little beast. But athletes who tend to have injuries and go out sideways, I think that's a bigger challenge, and that's a harder thing to work with, and it takes a little bit longer. And so, I'd always encourage those athletes and their friends and family to be patient with them, because that's a harder psychological pill to swallow.
It's interesting you talk about family and friends. What have you noticed in working with athletes in their transition, their closest supporters, spouses, parents, close friends, associates? What kind of toll does an athlete's transition take on those closest to them?
Oh, it's big. It's really big, because there's a loss of identity for everybody. And it's a loss of identity in the athlete, but the spouse of the athlete also suffers something about their spouse being lost, right? I mean, and so to love someone who's going through a painful transition, it takes a toll. I mean, you can't be in a relationship with somebody who is suffering without that taking a toll and without that being painful to watch as well. The other thing that seems to happen is that when an athlete loses a sport or retires from sport, they also lose a lot of their friends. And so a lot of times the social circle closes off and becomes very isolated. So the athlete not only loses the sport, loses a part of themselves, but also loses all these connections and all these relationships. They don't belong anymore. And so they may not see their friends quite as often as they used to, if at all. And so that sense of isolation really, really grows and becomes very caustic. And then what they can do in a marital relationship or with an athlete and a family is that athlete can rely more on them and become very needy in some circumstances, or withdraw even more. Right? I just don't want to be around anybody. Nobody wants to be around me. I don't want to be around them.
Right. I felt all those, and I'm sure a lot of our listeners have felt or are feeling the same way. It's interesting you talk about relationships, and talking to some of our other guests. How important is it to foster those relationships while you're competing, to be able to have some foresight to be able to call on those relationships down the road? And it might be business relationships or contacts of whatever degree. Is it important for those athletes to maintain those relationships while they're playing so it can help them afterward?
There's no question. There's absolutely no question. And I think the most successful athletes I've seen work a transition are those who, especially at the professional level, who understood at the time that they were in a business. Because it is. I mean, there's just no, you can talk about how awesome sports are all day long, but at the end of the day, they are a business at the professional level and certainly at the D1 level too. And that realizing that everybody that they are meeting are future business partners. The business may be a slightly different business, but having inroads, if you want to stay in the sport and stay involved in the sport, or have someone write you a letter of recommendation for a different kind of business. And so, maintaining those relationships or being professional and cordial, and then also fostering the friendship part of that as well. I think that's huge.
Right. Changing gears just a little bit, I've talked to some of my former athletes, and as they were going through it, one word that kind of seemed to keep coming up was overwhelm. How do you work with athletes that come to you and just feel overwhelmed with what's next for them? And it may be positive, maybe negative, but they just feel overwhelmed. Maybe they're not making the kind of income. Like we talked about, they lost some social status and identity, and also trying to find their next thing. But it can be overwhelming. Yeah. What are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, it's overwhelming is the feeling that we get when all of a sudden we're being flooded with a lot of anxiety, and it's just our system's way of going, well, that's way too much. I'm out of here. And anxiety. The way I always think about anxiety is that it's our mind's way of predicting the future. That anxiety is us predicting the future, and we're predicting a bad future that we can't see. And so when an athlete comes to me feeling overwhelmed, which I certainly don't blame them for, the thing I want to do is to get them to focus on what do you need to take care of right now, and really being clear about, well, do you have rent money? Do you have food money? Do you have a place to go? Or do you. And so in some ways, the anxiety and the feeling of being overwhelmed comes with a timeline that stretches into the future infinitely. Like there's all these things out there, and I'm worrying about all of them at the same time. But the more you truncate that timeline and say, okay, what do we need to worry about for the next 2 weeks? What do we need to worry about for the next 3 months? Whatever that is, so that they're starting to put one foot in front of the other, and then the future will begin to unravel or unfold itself in front of them in a more deliberate way once they start moving. But sometimes just that movement is going to be the most helpful thing in giving them a sense of agency and a sense that they know where they're headed.
Right, and I think as looking back as you're talking, I think the biggest thing for me coming out of what was a depression was just getting out of the house and just going and interviewing and taking any kind of job just to kind of get moving and get started with it. You're talking about overwhelm, but the game plan, the life game plan you talked about early on in our conversation, what you just talked about is just of getting moving sounds like maybe the first step in developing a game plan for somebody who's going through this process. What might be some other steps from there?
I think relying on others, to ask for help and support, for guidance. Even sometimes coaches and former coaches can be really useful in that way, being able to ask them, well, what do you see and what do you think about this, about the business of this sport? Because often coaches will have a better understanding, a better perspective of the business of the sport if the athlete still wants to stick in there. And the coach might actually have a lot of experience with that themselves that would be useful. So I think athletes often don't want to reach out, but in fact, this is the point at which they need to do so even more. And this is not one of those times where you just need to tough it out by yourself and figure things out. This is a time to make use of resources. And part of moving forward is just gathering the information and learning about themselves and what's available and asking for help when it's there.
Excellent, excellent. A couple more questions for you, and we're just about out of time. I'm curious to know the difference between your best clients that you've had that you've seen have the most success transitioning, and maybe the difference between the clients that continue to struggle through the process. Can you share with us the difference between the two?
Yeah. The ones that I've seen do it really well, and with almost a sense of grace and purpose, were the ones who could see it coming, and were actually kind of looking forward to that transition. Sometimes you get that too, which is kind of a neat thing. It's like, yeah, you know what, I'm kind of tired of my body feeling like this, and I just don't want to have to hurt myself anymore. And geez, I'd really love to have a pizza from time to time. So people who kind of have that perspective, and that perspective comes because there's other things that they've gotten a taste of. They've been around people who are eating pizza, and they've been around other things that have captured their interest, and they are able to look at it and see it as like, this is a business that I'm engaged in. It's a business that I can only do until I am 30 whatever, or 20 whatever, or 40 whatever the age is. And then after that, I have to do something else. And the likelihood that I'm going to make so much money that I never have to work again, that just doesn't happen. And so those who really were able to see it coming, to understand that it was a business and something that they should enjoy and do while they do it, but then also had that eye on the afterward part. The ones who have really struggled have been the ones who have sacrificed everything, who have just really sacrificed everything and not taken the time to explore or expand or to get interested and involved in other things, other hobbies and other things on the side, or who live very reclusive lives. And then when those athletes don't have the choice about retirement, either they get sick or they get injured, that tends to be a real challenge, and those people will struggle for a long time, particularly if they're trying to make comebacks or perform when they're not quite healthy, and that tends to just hang for a really long time.
Interesting stuff. Great stuff, Dr. Smith. One last question for you. What's the legacy you would like to leave for others?
Oh, great. One is that we need to, I think just the legacy that you're leaving here with this message, I think is huge and really important, that this is a big deal. This is really important, and this is vital for the mental health of people that we cheer and the people that we root for, is that we have to be thoughtful about what happens to them after the lights go off and the crowd dies down. That it is vital to understand the loss that comes with losing a sense of identity for athletes. And so part of what I want people to know is that this is a big deal, this is important, and we need to support people through these types of transitions. Then the other thing I think is really important is, let's not build myopic athletes. So let's have athletes with a diversified sense of self. Let's have youth sport that is balanced and integrated with other parts of a kid's life, so that we can raise healthy athletes who are very thoughtful and have lots and lots of interests. And I think that will also ease that transition.
Wonderful stuff. Well, everyone, we certainly hope you've enjoyed our conversation with the incredible Dr. Steve Smith. I know I have. You've been listening to the Championship Showcase, Secrets for Success, from the playing field of competition to the field of life. Dr. Smith talked about early education is best. Get moving. Ask for help. Expand your sense of self. And this is important work. Dr. Smith, any last words before we officially sign off for our listeners?
No, I think I'm good. Thank you so much. I really appreciate this. I think you're doing an important thing here.
Well, we appreciate you, and we appreciate your time. We want to thank again Dr. Steve Smith for joining us, and we encourage those of you who feel you might need some assistance through your career, please reach out, get the necessary help you need. You have purpose and you have value. For now, for Dr. Steve Smith, this is Dominic Militello. We want to wish you all the best always. Thanks, Dr. Smith.
You bet. Thank you.